All right, here's our video. Spontaneous generation. What is this? All right, so let's just look at the first word, spontaneous. Let's circle that. Circle it right here. Spontaneous, instantly, right? So it's very important to know that this used to be a theory. Let's write it over here. This used to be a theory. It's no longer a theory. It's been proven wrong. Used to be a theory, and it goes all the way back to a person named Aristotle, or even before him, but he wrote this down. And Aristotle lived about, there's a little C meaning circa, about 350 years before Christ, 350 BC, a long, long time ago. And he believed, and this whole theory that's now debunked, he said that life could arise, life rose from non-living matter. He also believed that life rose through living matter, through sexual and asexual reproduction. But he also thought with living matter, life rose from non-living matter, non-living material, we'll say, non-living material, if, big if, it contained something which he called, and of course he didn't use English because wasn't invented yet, vital heat. Vital heat, which is pneuma. Pneuma is this vital heat. So if it contained this vital heat, he believed in spontaneous generation. Now what he saw, and he wrote in his book on the generation of animals, he saw fish appear in mud and in puddles that just seemed to appear. And many people saw this too. And so many people believed what Aristotle said, and not just within biology, but a lot of theories of Aristotle were believed for thousands of years, like believing that the Earth was the center of the universe in the geocentric theory, believing that if you drop two objects with different weights, Aristotle believed that the heavy object would land first, but Galileo proved that wrong. So there's a lot of things Aristotle was proven wrong about, but it happened thousands of years later. So anyway, a lot of scientists would believe in spontaneous generation until about the 1800s. Now we could talk about even another poet, not a person named Virgil, who was a poet in Rome, and he thought he had a recipe to make bees. And so there was these recipes that you could make non-living things, and of course it's just not true. The one with the bees, though, is if you took, and it's in Virgil's books, right? He thought that if you took a cow, and you beat it to death, very gruesome, right? And while it was dead, while it was dying, you blocked its mouth, you blocked its nose, and you put the carcass on a bed of cinnamon. Then magically these creatures will appear. He thought bees will appear. And of course, this is all nonsense. Now, this is going to go on, and there's going to be recipes to make mice and the recipes to make scorpions. And even people thought that rats appear in garbage. Well, we know rats love garbage, but they don't appear. They don't just spontaneously generate in garbage. So these ideas are going to last for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden, here comes a guy named Francisco Redi. So let's talk about him. Okay, let's get our pen. What should we use? Let's use yellow. See how that is. So Francisco Redi, he lived in the 1600s, and he believed he wasn't really a fan of spontaneous generation. So he wanted to prove, he took these flasks, these jars, let's say, and he put some meat in them, put some meat in the jars. He believed that maggots will appear in the meat, not spontaneously. He thought that flies did it, which of course is true. So he put meat in this jar and he left one jar open. And then he used another jar. And of course, he had his meat in the other jar. Same experiment. But this time, he closed the jar. And of course, later on, what you find is maggots did appear on the meat that was opened, which we would say is common sense. And none appeared in the closed jar. Now, a lot of people were saying, well, yes, but they thought that the air, which again, remember what Aristotle said 2,000 years before, had this vital heat, that organisms need the air to grow, these maggots. So he set up another jar, glass, whatever you want to call it. And this time he put on this kind of cloth, this mesh, right? And of course he had his meat, whatever type of meat he's using, who knows. And of course the maggots didn't appear. They appeared on the top though. Use a different color for the maggots, even though they're yellow. They're whitish yellow really. So we'll say these green are the maggots. So the air went through, this air was going through, but the flies, according to Reddy, couldn't get into the meat. But the flies were probably laying their eggs on this cloth, and these maggots appeared on the top. So what Reddy proved is that maggots do form from flies. And he was the first step on saying that spontaneous generation wasn't true. Now we're going to jump 100 years to a guy named John Needham. So let's clear that out. Clear this out. And let's keep yellow. Why not? So this guy named John Needham, he supported spontaneous generation. And he lived around 1730s, 1731 to 1781. That's when he lived. And what he did is he set up an experiment. He had this flask. Try to make a flask here. And he put in this flask chicken broth. A little chicken soup. And he boiled it, not broiled it. So he boiled the chicken broth. And then he closed it up. And what he found is when he broiled the chicken broth, and at this time the microscope was around, people knew about microorganisms at this time. What they didn't know is that microorganisms like germs could kill. They didn't know that yet. But they did know they were microorganisms. And when he broiled this, and then he found that the microorganisms survived. Microorganisms were in the chicken broth. So he found that microorganisms were in the chicken broth. After he broiled them. Say broiled, I mean boiled. Say broiled twice today. In the chicken broth, the chicken soup. And he, again, should be noted that he was a fan of spontaneous generation. So we're not sure how he boiled it. And one person who was not a fan of spontaneous generation, I'll write his name over here, Spallanzani, who lived around the same time, born a little earlier, 1729, died in 1799, just like George Washington, right? Now, he thought that Needham didn't broil it. Boy, I said broil 3 times today. He said he didn't boil it. Make sure we have the big boil over here. Not broil, boil. He said that Needham did not boil the chicken broth for enough time. That's what he said. He didn't boil it long enough. And so when Spallanzani did the experiment over and over again, he found there were no microorganisms if he boiled it longer than Needham. So now we're going to come to the last person, Louis Pasteur. Let's write his name down. And by the way, when Spallanzani proved Needham wrong, Needham fired back. He said, listen, you need that vital heat from the air. And when Spallanzani did this experiment, and he closed off the flasks before it was boiled. Needham did it after, because he said you needed that air. The vital heat was in the air. So Louis Pasteur, he's going to say, okay, I'm going to set up an experiment where the air could come in, but the microorganisms cannot, and that should settle it. So let's clear this out. So what he did is he created these flasks, and they had this like these necks, these special necks, and they were S-shaped. They called it like swan-shaped. And the purpose of it was for the air to come in. Now the air is blue, right? So the air could come in, but microorganisms would settle here. So we'll just make the microorganisms green. So this is where the microorganisms should be. Not in, I'll use red, the chicken broth. If this happened, these necks worked. And so when Pasteur did this, and Pasteur lived, let's write his name there, Pasteur. He lived 1822 to 1895. And so when he did these experiments, lo and behold, the microorganisms stayed there, the air came in, and there were no microorganisms in the broth. And when he broke the flasks, so if he made another flask with the broth, and he cracked the flask, he noticed that the microorganisms were indeed in the broth. So he settled, finally, that there was no vital heat in the air because the air was coming in and no microorganisms were formed. So it is Louis Pasteur that will debunk this theory of spontaneous generation. All right, that's our video today.